Well, survivors, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to see faces in the auditorium at this late hour. It's a distinction for me to be here on this program. It's been a great series of talks, and really an honor for me to be able to talk about Whistler, who, as those of you who know me know, is the sort of antithesis of the Sargent school that I usually discuss. I want to thank Peter and Paula and Margaret and all the scholars we've heard today. And I'm here, I guess, to bring you a little bit down to earth. I've been invited to speak about Whistler and his place in Boston's new wing for Art of the Americas. And, like Susan, was asked to concentrate on the challenges and the opportunities that curators face in presenting works by Whistler within the larger context of museum installations. I've been thinking a lot today about the great ideas we've heard and how one might bring these academic ideas into a popular space of a museum gallery. I'm going to give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes tour of our new wing, discussing in particular the complex gallery that includes our paintings by Whistler. But I'd also like to intertwine that journey with some more theoretical concepts, specifically the issues of nationalism and cosmopolitanism that come up, or I believe should come up, in the study of American art. Mr. Whistler will not allow us to use the phrase American art, wrote George Smiley in 1902 for Munsey's Magazine, a popular journal that called itself a magazine of the people and for the people. This is a 1940 stamp, by the way, the Famous Artists series. Smiley was a writer and the London correspondent for the New York Tribune, and as a reporter, he'd earned his stripes during the Civil War at the front. In his article, Smiley went on to note that Whistler had, and I quote, long since denounced that art is of no nationality. Smiley then declared that no matter how unpatriotic he knew his assessment would have sounded to some of his readers, that Whistler's artistic career would not have been possible in the United States. What then is Whistler's art even doing in the wing devoted to Art of the Americas? How do you take a painter who was so international and cosmopolitan in his outlook, a man who refrained from correcting anyone who thought he might have been born anywhere on earth besides Lowell, Massachusetts, a citizen who left the United States in 1855 when he was 21 years old and never returned? How do you take such an artist and display his work in galleries devoted to American art? Well, the question of nationality is one that circles constantly in American art, particularly in the late 19th century, an era of global connections eerily similar to our own. The same subject came up around the career of John Singer Sargent, a painter who was not even born or educated in the United States, but about whom Henry James remarked that Americans, and I quote, would be well advised to claim him. Whistler himself would later tease Sargent about his nationality on the occasion of Sargent's election as an associate of the Royal Academy in 1894. Whistler wrote to Sargent in language apprehended from Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta HMS Pinafore, whether, in spite of great temptation, Sargent had chucked his nation to become an English man. Sargent replied that the London academicians had not requested that he retouch his nationality, noting with good humor, "I keep my twang." Lest Whistler thought he was kidding, Sargent added rather stiffly, "If you should hear anything to the contrary, please state that there was no such transaction and that I am an American." Was Whistler ever that firm on the subject? He sometimes referred to America as his home. Most often, he declared himself only when it was advantageous in legal terms. In August 1873, he firmly avowed his American citizenship to avoid jury duty in London. In 1890, he reminded his lawyer that he had full rights as a citizen of the United States in connection with an infringement of copyright to do with pirated copies of his written work. And several times in the 1890s, he affirmed his citizenship to avoid paying export duties on his works when shipping them to America. Well, Nick Tchaikovsky, Charlie Brock, Linda Merrill, and Lee Glazer, among others, have written extensively about Whistler as an American and about Whistler's place in American art. And I don't intend to repeat their work here, but I want to remind you of it, because the issue is of critical importance in terms of how we, as curators, define American art. Whistler, Sargent, Cassatt. To which curatorial department are they assigned, American or European? You'll find that it varies from museum to museum, from continent to continent. What do we choose to include in our galleries of American art or in our galleries of European art? And how do we explain those choices to our visitors? Well, if Whistler started his adult life by serving at one of the nation's most patriotic institutions, West Point, by 1886, the American critic Charles Dickey reported that, and I quote, "It would be hard to say to which nationality he belongs." And Whistler cultivated that ambiguity, becoming French, English, or Japanese as the occasion suited him, wearing his nationality like a thin cloak, as if it were one of the veils of color that envelop his landscapes, making them dreamlike and ambiguous, more Whistlerian than Chilean, Italian, or British. But although a critic from the New York Times announced in 1885 that Whistler had, and I quote, "forgotten everything American," William C. Brownell declared in 1890 that Whistler was more of an American than anything else. And that's where the issue came to rest at the Museum of Fine Arts when we began to plan our new wing. The new wing has 53 galleries devoted to the display of over 5,000 works of art from the Americas, from the indigenous cultures of the ancient Americas to the third quarter of the 20th century. And it opened in Boston just a year ago. I'm showing you the facade of the wing at the top, and on the lower right, the sort of peacock Whistlerian blue galleries are the American galleries. Purple is Art of Europe. Yellow on the bottom right is the ancient world, the lighter yellow Asian, and the green contemporary. As our spaces were planned, our curatorial team had a common goal, which was to not create a ghetto of American art. Instead, we sought to look at American art in context, accepting that it was not created in isolation, or even, for that matter, in the United States. We wanted to take advantage of the connections that we could make to the rest of the museum's encyclopedic collections. As Henry James declared in 1867, the same year that Whistler first displayed his Symphony in White No. 3, the arts in America were becoming, and I quote, "a vast intellectual fusion and synthesis of the various national tendencies of the world." What better place, then, than in this new wing to display the art of Whistler, that master of fusion and synthesis? We also hope to explore and bring to our public's attention the constant push and pull between nationalism and cosmopolitanism that in many ways does define American art, particularly in the 19th century. These two paintings, Fitzhenry Lane's Owl's Head, Penobscot Bay on your left, and Whistler's Last of Old Westminster, were painted in the same year, 1862. And we had to find a way in the galleries to make both of them feel at home. I'm going to restrict my talk today to the display of Whistler's paintings, although the MFA holds almost 300 prints, as well as one canceled plate, several illustrated books, 3 drawings, a watercolor, and a letter. The collection is by no means comprehensive, but it is very fine. There have been different strategies for its display over the years, and I'm showing you the first building of the MFA, which opened in Copley Square in the 1870s, the exterior and the interior. The MFA had been founded in 1870. It opened its doors on July 4th, 1876, a patriotic day, if ever there was one. The institution collected American art from the start, and in fact, the first object of art to be acquired by the whole museum was a painting by Washington Allston. In the earliest days, the collection was installed by medium, as you can see at the lower right, so that all the paintings were hung together, French and American, in the same room. You can see a Winslow Homer fog warning on the left side of the doorway, and on the right wall, Millet and Courbet. The MFA invested in Whistler very, very early during the artist's lifetime. This pair of the Blacksmith and the Little Rose, both of Lyme Regis from 1895, were purchased the year after they were painted for $7,200. The MFA was the second American museum after Philadelphia to acquire Whistler's work for its permanent collection. And you see the two paintings hanging here in a salon-style display at the MFA from around 1900 that no doubt would have been anathema to Whistler. The next one to come was this tiny street scene, street in Old Chelsea from 1880 to 85. It was a gift to the museum in 1909 from the great Boston collector, teacher, and color theorist Denman Ross, who owned it by 1902. Ross gave thousands of things to the MFA, and I'm showing you here at the right 3 of the other things he gave us, the 3 Monets he had bought in the 1890s, and you see them hanging here at the MFA at a very early date. The next picture to enter the collection was Last of Old Westminster of 1862. It came much later. Came to the MFA in 1939, when the museum bought it for $15,000 from one Mrs. John Riddle, who you see here at lower right. Mrs. John Riddle is better known as Theodate Pope, the architect and founder of the Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut. And she had inherited the painting in 1913 from her father, the important Impressionist collector Alfred Atmore Pope, who had bought it in New York in 1898. You see Alfred Atmore Pope next to his daughter, and one of their other great whistlers that remains at Hillstead, the Great Blue Wave, at the upper right. We very much prize this Nocturne, one of the very rare oil paintings that Whistler completed during his 14-month stay in Venice, a time when he concentrated most of his energy on making etchings and pastels. Richard Canfield, who you see again here at right, the second most important collector of Whistler's work in America after Freer, had seized the opportunity to buy this canvas when it came on the market after Whistler's death in 1903. Canfield, as you've heard, was the proprietor of fashionable, if illegal, gambling houses in New York City, Saratoga, and Newport. But he was a refined and cultured collector, and near the end of Whistler's life, Canfield developed a friendship with the painter. Whistler painted Canfield's portrait from 1901 to 1903. He admired his connoisseurship, and he was amused by his unsavory reputation. The Nocturne was sold when Canfield died in 1914 after injuries sustained in a subway accident. It came down through a single family until it was sold to the MFA in 1942 for $9,000. And finally, this lovely oil, Harmony in Flesh Color in Red, from about 1869, which the MFA bought for $12,000 in 1960, although the director, Perry Rathbone, confessed to the dealer that, to his surprise, getting it past the museum's collections committee had not been an easy task. Despite these choice acquisitions, by the 1950s, the relative position of American art had fallen precipitously. At the MFA, the displays of European and American paintings were separated, and American art got the inferior space. While European paintings were installed in gracious, coved, skylit galleries covered with fabric, the American works got the space below stairs, which you see at lower right, lower ceilings, dropped fluorescent tracks, and walls painted white. You can see Whistler's Nocturne hanging there, looking a little forlorn between a Blakelock and a rider. In the 1980s, things got a little better when the lighting was improved in those galleries and the walls were painted a more harmonious color. Here you can see Last of Old Westminster, with urban views by American painters with an urban sensibility, among them Childe Hassam. Soon the fashion for display in museums called for mixed media galleries, and you see that same gallery here in what we like to call the aughts, in the 2000s, with some elements of furniture and decorative arts brought into play. And these installations grew progressively more elaborate, dense, and complex, necessitating a new level of commitment on the part of the museum in terms of cost and staff, crew, conservators, designers, and curators, but which were an aesthetic and popular success with the public. And this is where we were when the plans for the new wing began. The new wing, and you see the whole plan here, was designed by Foster and Partners of London. And our biggest concern as curators for it was how to show old art in new spaces, something that's not necessarily easy to do. We'd been to a lot of new museums where the architect held sway, where walls were all painted white and the displays were really about the building, but not so much about the art that was in it. And at the MFA, we were very keen to have the art come first. We had a mandate for the new wing, that it would be a mix of all medias in which artists worked in Art of the Americas, and also that it would begin with the ancient Americas at the foundation level on the lower ground floor, which you see at the bottom of the slide, and work its way up to the 20th century, hanging on a chronological skeleton. We wanted to emphasize throughout all of these galleries that American art was born of trade and contact. Even in the ancient American times, the issues of trade and contact were paramount. There are a few places where American and European things are juxtaposed, but we really didn't want to intermix too much. But through labeling, photographs on labels, and on our handheld media guide, which includes video, it's an iPad Touch, information on related objects throughout the collection. Well, the centerpiece of the 19th century floor, the second floor of the wing, is not surprisingly John Singer Sargent, Boston's favorite 19th century artist, and inevitable, if you know me, a sort of great satisfaction. But if you're standing in front of the Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd and you turn to your right, you see 3 fabulous stained glass windows. What that does is tell you immediately that we've leveled the playing field between paintings and decorative arts. Here are 3 windows, 2 by Lafarge and 1 by Tiffany, that introduce our gallery devoted to the aesthetic movement. If you walk into that room and turn to your left, you see the Whistlers, the Smith and the Lagoon here. And as you continue to walk around the room, you come around the corner and see a display of a Japonisme anchored by a wonderful Hirshler cabinet. You can see the symphony and harmony and flesh color in red there above a Hirshler chair. And then you come around the room to another wall of paintings that features the last of Old Westminster. Well, if you walk back to that Hirshler group and you turn around, you're in for a bit of an aesthetic shocker. This is one of the visual surprises that we sought to include to vary the visitor's experience throughout the galleries, to make different ways of looking at art throughout the wing, and to really do it upright for the aesthetic movement. It was something that happened at the last minute and completely by accident. We were offered as a gift this Fireplace Surround in 2008, which came from the drawing room of a townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston's Back Bay. You can see it here at the right in a period photograph of Elizabeth Spooner's residence. The building was completed in 1881 by the Boston architects Peabody and Stearns, and the house reflected the current fashion for colonial revival architecture mixed with the aesthetic movement and the owner's passion for Asia, where she had once lived. Although some of the carved elements were probably imported from China, the Fireplace Surround was filled out and assembled by Boston craftsmen. The painting that once hung in the middle of it was long gone, and we thought we would fill it with an ebonized panel and hang on it one of our decorative panel paintings by John Lafarge. But then this painting came on the market by a little well-known American artist who had worked with Lafarge, a man named John Humphreys Johnston, who I'd never heard of before I saw this picture. It's called La Domino Rose, and it was painted about 1895. Well, you might like the painting, and you might think it was worthwhile for the MFA collection, but when it fit in the fireplace, it was a done deal. And we constructed an entire vignette around it. And I'm just going to show you how complicated that process is. Wallpaper reproduction after a design by Candace Wheeler, the fireplace being installed, the painting going into it, and the kitting out with the rest of the furnishings and decorative arts. So where is Whistler in all of that? Well, I think you can just get a glimpse of Little Rose here. And in this gallery, in terms of the paintings, I would say that Whistler really is the thread that ties them all together. Here are the major paintings in the room, each of them bound together in a relationship that's tied by Whistler. On the left, John White Alexander's Isabella and the Pot of Basil from 1897, Alexander's masterpiece, and one of the only American paintings to capture the decadence of the French Art Nouveau style. Alexander had known Whistler since 1879 when he was in Venice with the Duveneck boys. He started to make a portrait of Whistler in London in 1886, and when Alexander settled in Paris in 1891, he reestablished his friendship with Whistler, who arrived the following year. The Johnston, which we've looked at, Johnston turns out to have been a wealthy New Yorker who trained as an artist with John Lafarge and then went to Europe. We don't know too much more, but we know that he was active in Paris in the 1890s and that he knew both John White Alexander and Whistler. A letter of 1894 reveals that Johnston had invited Whistler to a lunch he was hosting for Lafarge. The idea of these nets and networks really speaks here, I think. Whistler was not able to go to the lunch, but they did remain friends and acquaintances. And one of Whistler's letters to Richard Canfield in 1902 tells us that Whistler was still in touch with Johnston, asking him to report on how Whistler's own paintings had been installed at the Société Nationale exhibition in Paris. Under the Johnston, the room interior that you see here is by William Merritt Chase from about 1896. Chase was one of Whistler's chief admirers and promoters in the United States, although their personal friendship had dissolved into quarrels in the 1880s. And on the right, a painting of Francis Tyleston Breeze by Edward Steichen, better known as a photographer. This is a portrait from about 1906. Steichen was profoundly influenced by Whistler from the time he first saw the painter's work, not in person, but in reproduction, in prints, at the Milwaukee Public Library. Well, Whistler is also very much a pivot in terms of explanation and explication of style. We talk very much about Japonisme when we talk about late 19th century American art, but it's hard to explain to a general audience just what it means. Somehow, when you put it all together in a display like this, people finally get it. We can also make connections to other parts of the collection. The Japanese print by Udamaro at the left of women arranging flowers, or the late 18th century tsuba, or sword guard, that you see at lower right, with its insect decorations that inspired the decoration that the Herder brothers put on the cabinet in the center. Well, I'm showing you here a connection to Japan, but I could equally address connections between Whistler and classical art, the art of the ancient world, the arts of Europe, and even now, today, of Denmark. Henry James wrote to his friend Thomas Perry in an oft-quoted letter of September 1867 that, quote, "To have no national stamp has hitherto been a defect and a drawback." But James then went on to say that to be an American was, quote, "an excellent preparation for culture." Insofar as Americans could deal more freely than Europeans with forms of civilization not their own. As James said, Americans could, and I quote, "pick and choose and assimilate and in short, aesthetically claim their property wherever they found it. Well, James's words about picking and choosing find an echo in Whistler's remarks that we heard earlier today from the 10 o'clock. Nature contains the elements and color and form of all pictures, as the keyboard contains the notes of all music. But the artist is born to pick and to choose. He brings forth from chaos glorious harmony. At the MFA, I think Whistler's works hang in this gallery devoted to the aesthetic movement and really speak to cosmopolitanism. The display and its accompanying interpretive materials are designed to open those intellectual doors between the arts of the United States, England, France, Japan, the classical world, wherever. And rather than standing apart from the art of his time, it seems to me that Whistler serves to bring its disparate strands together. And what would Whistler think? Showing you here two designs for Whistler interiors at the top, and of course his arrangement in white and yellow, the fine arts installation at lower left. Well, one suspects that as an artist who cared deeply about design and decoration, who carefully planned several of his own exhibition installations with color harmonies as sophisticated as those of the works within them, he would have been relieved to find that most of his paintings hang on a simple blue-gray wall, away from the cacophony of the aesthetic movement vignettes. But how much more we learn about display and its effect on works of art, lessons that Whistler was anxious to teach us by having both strategies in play. Part of our plan was to provide throughout the wing a variety of installation styles, reminding our visitors that the very look of the galleries themselves, and not just of the objects within them, can reflect a historic period, a particular place, and of course are always subject to change and to individual taste. In the end, the new walls on which Whistler's paintings hang are not so different, if they are a bit yet less densely installed, than the ones that were so carefully designed to demonstrate Whistler's aesthetic for his 1904 memorial exhibition at the Copley Society in Boston, which you see in the two black and white images at lower right. The walls of the memorial exhibition were especially painted light gray and covered with a silvery, iridescent woven grass cloth. The rooms were punctuated with Japanese carvings over the doorways. And I would hope, in the end, Charles Lang Freer's words of 1902 still ring true when he said, "The Boston people really seem to care for Mr. Whistler's work." Thank you, and I hope you'll all come.